your children go to this school, ma'am?
No, they don't. They go to a religious school not far away.
Well, what is the reason for your presence on the picket line today?
I believe the children of the Bedford-Stuyvesant area deserve their own school. They shouldn't have to be bused and used as pawns by politicians.
In 1954, the United States Supreme Court set aside the Kansas statute that permitted cities of 15,000 or more to maintain separate schools for black and white students, ruling that segregation is inherently unequal. This case became known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In 1955, the court asked that desegregation proceed with all deliberate speed.
In 1969, schools were a little different than they are today. We didn't have, schools were not integrated per se. Coming out of high school, there were separate school systems in Alabama. And then most towns had their own little school system that operated two schools.
While most states began the process of integration, in some states this led to violence. The most notable instance was the defiance in 1967 of federal orders by the governor of Arkansas, who called out the Arkansas National Guard to prevent integration in Little Rock. President Eisenhower responded by sending federal troops to enforce the court order for integration.
Brown versus the Board of Education, they said separate but equal was illegal. And that started in the 50s, and it was into the 60s that this started to be enforced in the South. So in 1968, they came up with a program that was called Freedom of Choice. And that's where children were allowed to choose which school they wanted to go to. So there are different choices that were made by different people through different areas in the South. As we look at it, a lot has come from then. So therefore, that was the only perspective of education that had been known.
In 1958, Virginia closed 9 schools in 4 counties rather than have them integrated. In Louisiana, whites boycotted the integrated New Orleans public schools. In 1961, 2 black students registered at the University of Georgia but were suspended because of student disorders. In Mississippi, a black man registered at the University of Mississippi. A mob attacked, and 2 people were killed. The next day, federal troops occupied Oxford, and James Meredith became the first African American to attend a Mississippi public school in accordance with the 1954 court decision. And in Alabama in 1963, Governor George C. Wallace stood in a doorway at the University of Alabama in a symbolic attempt to block 2 black students from enrolling. The attempt failed.
As we look at these time periods, we see that times have changed. People have worked to learn to work together in a different society, but you learn about different cultures. For a long time, the only culture you knew about was the culture you lived in, and the other one you read about in a book of some type or some nature. As we look at it, as times have changed, there have been people who have learned to work together, to live together, and that's where we are in 2014, that we are able to have some of these conversations going on.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the nation's benchmark civil rights legislation. It continues to resonate in America today. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Passage of the act ended the application of Jim Crow laws. The Civil Rights Act was eventually expanded by Congress to strengthen endorsement for these fundamental civil rights.
Well, I think as a country we have definitely made a lot of great strides since the 1950s and 1960s. I think as far as racism, and definitely institutional racism isn't really around anymore, and that's a great thing.
So I moved from Italy, and we studied their American history as well, and as well as European history. And we studied the process of integration, and we found out what was happening in the United States. Coming here, I see that it's gotten a lot better than I read in the books, and sometimes you see people that maybe have still the ideas, but they're not as much as I've read in the books. Like here, white people and black people cooperate, and they like lead together, like as if there was no racial difference, and that's really nice to see.
In a lot of the textbooks and some of the pictures you see, there's all-white football teams or all-white baseball or basketball teams just because the schools weren't integrated, but obviously now our sports teams in our schools are integrated, and so it's given me an opportunity to meet a lot of awesome black guys and play sports with them, run track with them, and get to know them. And they have a whole lot of ability, and they bring a lot to the team and a lot to our school.
Process that worked here in Auburn City Schools, they started with the 10th grade, the upcoming 10th grade, and they were coming to Auburn High School. Later on, they gradually moved all the grades to Auburn High School and made the other schools smaller groups, elementary schools, so that these would be serviceable for the school system. So everybody was going to school all the time. As we begin to look at the longevity of this program, we see that sometimes students have benefited from learning to work with people, to be included in part of society.
I think like integration has like successfully reached like the point where we wanted it to be, because like people here have no problem with integrating one another, and you don't have like the racial differences and the racial obstacles that you had like in the 60s, or when you had when people were completely separated and they were like having separate places in the movie theaters and everything. Like people hang out randomly and like as friends, and you can have as many friends as you want from another race, because like you don't have that like racial difference.
But I do think that it on its own can happen. And I think the point is when we start seeing ourselves as individuals, and individuals that are equal in the eyes of our Creator. They're free individuals that make their own contribution to society. I think that's ultimately what we need to see ourselves as, and we need to avoid one way or another, putting people in groups.
There has been if you look in terms of this, the society fully integrated, my answer to that would be no. Because there are still some times you walk around and see people who don't interact with the people. We have kids who go to school with each other that don't know their names. They don't associate with each other. They don't have any type of doings other than sometimes in school. So fully integrated, no. There's progress being made, but there's a lot of different areas and long ways to go.
I think we have successfully integrated, not only in the school system just with sharing each other's presence, but also culturally, that we've bonded and made friendships despite racial differences. I mean, there's not a whole lot of segregation that you see. It's not all the white people hanging out in one area and all the black people hanging out in the other. We've made quite a bit of friends across the racial differences, and there's really not a lot of prejudice there.
Since I came here, I thought it would be like all in the books, like people would be separated and things. But after I came here, I saw that it's not like that. Like people are like friends, and there's no problem in having like a black friend for a white person or vice versa.
Obviously, it will always exist. I mean, we're people, and people will always be flawed. But I think as a whole, our society has become a lot more integrated. It's a good thing for a free society like ours. It's good to have a diversity of backgrounds and of opinions and things.